So glad to be here with all of you this evening. It's a big night for us. We're very honored here. We're very honored. The speaker this evening is, he was ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1980. He practiced in Missouri, New York, and Massachusetts. He has a degree in comparative religion from Hamilton College and the Episcopal Divinity at Tufts. Him and his wife Lisa live at near Bunker Hill, and they, the words that Catherine used, that she was very charming, and Steve was very, very devoted to what he does. He is the vicar of the Old North Church, the executive director of the Old North Church, and he puts in 19,000 hours a week into the church. His wife says that he's very, very focused. So whatever he does, he just tunes into that. Catherine also said that he is a master of creating. Listen, my children, and you shall hear. She also used the word genius. And here's the real mood. A proclamation was read by Mayor Walsh proclaiming November 6th as Steve Ayers Day in Boston. On that note, I'd like to introduce Mr. Steve Ayers.
Thanks for the introduction. What you didn't say is I'm totally incompetent when it comes to electronics. And I brought my own computer here to be safe, but it does not sync with that. So if you can grab your computer, we'll see if the memory stick that I brought will work. Well, thank you very much. I'll do a little talking before we have some images for our PowerPoint. Just to let you know what I'm going to try to do tonight and a little more about who I am. I'm Steve Ayers. I'm the colleague of Walter's, so I'm also an Episcopal priest, but I'm wearing the official church tie rather than my church collar tonight. And I've served at Old North for about 22 years. My official title there is vicar, and I was asked, what does vicar mean? What it means is that Old North Church is a mission, unlike St. John's here. Old North is directly under the bishop's authority, and vicar means that I act vicariously for the bishop. So that's where my title comes from. I'm also the executive director of the Old North Foundation, which is a foundation that the church set up to keep some separation between church and historic site. And in that role, I run the Old North Historic Site, which is on a half-acre campus. The church, of course, is the best known part of the site, but there are actually 5 buildings and several gardens in that half an acre. Not only the church, we have a gift shop, we have office buildings, and we have a house that's actually older than the church called the Clough House, built by Ebenezer Clough, who was a master mason, who also built the church. So at some point I'll have some images of some of these things to show you. What I'm going to try to do tonight is run through some of the church's history. We did have our 15 minutes of fame on April 18, 1775, but the church is almost 300 years old. We turned 300 in 2023, so there is a lot of history there. and it's not as famous as the two lanterns that were hung there. And I'm very glad that you welcomed me by having two lanterns on the head table. That's a nice touch. But I want to share with you some more of our history over that course of time, and then talk a little bit about, at the end, about how we are planning to celebrate not only our 300th birthday, but how we are planning to celebrate the other major milestone coming up, which is the 250th birthday of the nation. You need the, there you go.
Thank you.
And there's the memory stick. We'll get there, we hope. If not, you don't have to look at PowerPoint, you can just listen to me. But, you know, Old North is all about patriotism, and I wanted to start the talk tonight with an ode to patriotism, loosely based on the work of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and it goes like this. Listen, my country, and you shall hear on the 6th Super Bowl, that win that we revere. On the 3rd of February in 2019, the New England Patriots stepped onto the green and brought back a trophy amidst much cheer. He said to his team, if the Rams march by run or by pass in Atlanta tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 for Belichick and 2 for Brady. And Patriots on the goal line will be ready to cheer for our favorite GOAT through every New England town of note and praise his 6th ride on a Boston duck boat.
All right.
I do pride myself on being the doggerel king of Old North. So wedding, whatever, I can do doggerel on that poem. So it's a lot of fun to do. So while we're waiting for images, let me just start to talk about our history. Old North was built in 1723. It's actually the second Anglican church in Boston. King's Chapel was the first. Boston started as a Puritan town, and the last thing the Puritans wanted to see was the church that they were rebelling against. So King's Chapel was actually built in a cemetery because no good Puritan would sell an Anglican church any property. And the original King's Chapel was a wood frame building, and when they outgrew that building, they decided to build a second church, and they built it on the edge of town, and actually on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, if there were railroad tracks back then. The edge of the north end was a open field, and there was an orchard there, and we bought a small sliver of land in the orchard. That neighborhood was also home to Boston's black population. It was the first black neighborhood in Boston, and there's still several well-known blacks, especially Prince Hall, who are buried in Copp's Hill Cemetery, which is just up the street from Old North. So we bought that land in 1722, and first thing they needed was someone to lead the church, and they went down to Connecticut. So Old North needed a priest, and they went and got a Puritan. It was actually a man named Dr. Cutler, and Timothy Cutler, and he was sent down to New Haven to combat the Anglican heresy. And he was the rector or president of Yale College. He got up at commencement and said rather than combating the heresy, he wanted to join it. So Dr. Cutler left the employ of Yale. They actually fired him when he said he didn't want to be a Puritan anymore, and he came up to open Old North. He traveled over to England in 1723 to be ordained by the Bishop of London, and while he was over there, they took copies of the latest in church fashion. And at that point, the hot architect in England was Sir Christopher Wren, best known for St. Paul's Cathedral in London. They took some of the smaller churches, particularly St. James Piccadilly, and a very small church called St. Andrew's by the Wardrobe. And it was on the basis of those churches, they were quite similar. They came back and they gave pictures of those to our master mason and master carpenter and said, build us one of these. So The cornerstone was laid in April of 1723. The first services were held right after Christmas in December of 1723. At that point, the church was just an open barn. Here is a picture now of colonial Boston, and you'll see that the tallest steeple in that picture is Old North. Old North was the tallest building in colonial Boston, which came in very handy a few years later when Paul Revere needed a good place to send signals. So Dr. Cutler was there from 1723 to 1768. He, as a graduate of Harvard College and an ordained minister, had the right to sit on the Harvard Board of Overseers, and he tried to use that position to convert Harvard away from being Puritan to being Anglican, at which point Harvard promptly changed its bylaws and he was no longer on the Board of Overseers. But he was quite well known during his period, and when he died in office, and he was replaced by the Reverend Mather Biles Jr. Very similar to him in that they found him in Connecticut. He had been a Congregationalist, and he was ready to switch to the Anglican Church. His father was a Congregationalist minister in Boston, and his father was actually better known. He was known as the notorious Mather Biles. He had a very wicked sense of humor, and he was a Tory and often would preach against the Patriot leaders in Boston and skewer them with his wit. So Mather Biles Jr. Actually served, and this is a great coincidence between church history and dynamics and American history. He served at Old North until April 18th, 1775, the day the lanterns were hung. We do not have extensive vestry minutes from that day, but I think the discussion that morning was something like, "We hear you have another job offer, you better take it." He had been out looking for a job because the church had stopped paying him. The church was founded by merchants and sea captains, and their income was derived from trade. And once King George closed the port of Boston, the merchants and sea captains couldn't afford to pay their pew rents. We didn't pass the collection plate back then. You just paid an annual lease fee on your pew. And so the church didn't have enough money to pay the rector, and so he went off looking for another job, was offered a job in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but the day that he left the employ of the church, war broke out. So one of the members of the vestry was named Captain John Pulling, who was a friend of Paul Revere's, and Captain Pulling, along with the church sexton, Robert Newman, and Newman gets more of the credit than Pulling does. They both should get the credit. It was Newman and Pulling who actually hung the lanterns. I should say, we think so. The Pulling family says, "Oh, John did it all by himself." Wasn't the sexton. The Newman family said, "No, Robert did it all by himself. Pulling didn't do it." So we don't know. We actually have a really fun class for elementary school kids called History Mystery, Who Hung the Lanterns? And we send them running around the neighborhood looking for clues. Both Pulling and Newman are buried in Copsdale Cemetery. We have plaques to both of them on the campus, and they run around trying to do history, and then they want to come back and know what the answer is, and it's like, well, sometimes history doesn't have a clear answer. We don't know. My own thought, Captain Pulling was a sea captain, fairly wealthy. Robert Newman was the poor janitor. It's like, janitor, you go up and do it. But that's my own read of the history. So anyway, that night, two lanterns are hung in the steeple. Did they ask the minister if it was all right to do it? The minister, again, had left the employ of the church that morning. So there's nobody to ask. So there's nobody to ask. So you have a vestry member working with the sexton being key because he had the key.
That's my sexton.
Oh, okay. And so they were both Masons, and that's how they knew Paul Revere. Without the Masonic Lodge, the American Revolution would have never happened in Boston. Secret society, that's where all the secret planning went on. So, what basically happens that evening is that word comes back that the British are planning to march the next day. How did they know? Well, because the British lowered all their longboats from the ships out in the harbor. They had to do that so that the seams could swell up, because if you took a dry boat, put it in the water, and put a dozen heavily armed British soldiers in there, the boat would sink. So they had to let the seams swell up so it would be watertight. So once the boats came down, the spies in Boston knew that the British were going to be taking the shorter route to Lexington by rowing across the Charles River, the Back Bay, to Cambridge. That's one of the poetic licenses that Longfellow took. It was not to it by sea, it was to it by the Back Bay, but that doesn't rhyme very well. So, we get one it by land, to it by sea. So Revere goes to see Joseph Warren, who is essentially the head spy in Boston, and he's told to set all these events in motion. So he goes and tells Poling, it's 2 lanterns, hang them tonight. He goes home, gets changed for his own ride. Another erroneous part of the poem is that Revere was not standing in Charlestown. He already knew which way they were going. The lanterns are hung around dusk, and there are Sons of Liberty in Charlestown who are looking for the lantern signal. They see it. They immediately send out dozens of riders. You send riders out to every different town to alert the local militia. Revere had to wait for a couple hours for it to get dark enough for him to try to slip past the HMS Somerset, which was a British man of war parked in the harbor between the North End and Charlestown, specifically to stop Paul Revere. Revere had already been arrested once in a boat spying on the British. They knew who he was. There was a bounty on his head that night. They park a man of war there. They try to seize every rowboat they can in Boston and tie him up out in the harbor so nobody could get out. Revere was able to hire one rowboat, and lo and behold, even though the Somerset is there just to stop Revere, he got past him. So he gets to Charlestown, walks into town, picks up a rent-a-horse at the local livery. There's this story that Revere rode a horse called Brown Beauty. They did not name rent-a-horses back then. It's like if you go pick up a Ford Explorer, they're not going to say, here's Brown Beauty. They're going to say, here's your car. Same thing with Revere. So he picks up the horse, rides out to Lexington. He's almost intercepted on the way out there just past Charlestown Neck in what is now Somerville. He eludes the British patrol by riding back on the road and then heading up another road towards Medford. The British patrol, who don't know the area very well, it's like, oh, we can cut this guy off, and promptly rode into a swamp. They couldn't get him. So he gets to Medford. He finally gets to Lexington. Of course, Revere is one of 2 riders out that night. William Dawes was the other. Dawes had left Boston around noontime. He took the long way by riding out along Boston Neck, what's now Washington Street. And so he had a much longer ride. That was guarded by British sentries. How did Dawes get by? Well, for 2 weeks before the ride, because they knew this was coming, Dawes would go by the sentries every day. He'd pour some rum on himself, and he would just stagger in his saddle, and he was incredibly obnoxious. And so when the sentries on the actual day see old drunk Billy coming by again, stinking to high heaven, they're like, we're not going to babysit this guy all day. He's harmless, and let him through. So he gets through. Revere gets to Lexington about an hour or so before Dawes does. They deliver the warning to John Hancock and Sam Adams, and there ensues a classic political discussion. John Hancock, I want to fight in this battle because it'll be good when I want to be president. Sam Adams, you're too rich to do that, John. Let's get out of here. They have that argument for 3 hours. Meanwhile, Revere and Dawes go and have a drink at Buckman's Tavern to warm up, and then they decide to head out to Concord. On the way to Concord, they're stopped by British patrol. Dawes gets lost in the woods, gets away, and Revere is brought back to Lexington. On the way back, Revere is saying, British soldiers, you better go find the vanguard of your army. The woods, we've alarmed everybody. The woods are full of patriots. You are in big trouble. So they're about a quarter of a mile away from Lexington. They hear gunfire, and the British soldiers are like, well, he may be telling the truth. We'll take his horse. His horse died at Bunker Hill fighting for the British. And they let Revere go. It was not the battle breaking out. It was actually a bunch of soldiers showed up. It's about 3 in the morning. They calculate how long it would take a heavily loaded British patrol to march from Cambridge out to Lexington. They said, let's go have a drink in Buckman's Tavern. They had loaded muskets. You cannot carry a loaded gun into a building because if somebody knocks it over, somebody's going to be dead. So they discharged their guns. That saved Revere's life. Revere gets back to Lexington. And at that point, finally, they hear the British troops marching up the road, and Hancock finally wins, Hancock loses the battle. Adams wins the battle and says, let's get out of here. So they hightail it out of there in a hurry, and Hancock leaves his trunk of papers behind, enough information to hang all of, or half of Boston. Oh. And so Revere, when the battle's breaking out, is actually heading out the back of Buckman's Tavern with Hancock's trunk to hide it in the woods. And so he did not see who fired the first shot. We know all this because he was deposed after the war, because everybody wanted to know who fired the first shot. And he said, I was on the wrong side of the building. I didn't see. So that's the story that gives us our 15 minutes of fame. But it's not the end of the church's story. Church almost closed after the war. The church actually did close when Mather Biles Jr. left the employ of the church. We were without clergy, so they were closed for 3 years. They were reopened in 1778 by a British chaplain, who was chaplain to Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne's army. They, of course, lost a battle in Saratoga. They were brought to Charlestown. That was the prisoner of war camp. And so a British chaplain came over, reopened the church. But after the war, the church really struggled. Half of their congregation were Tories, and they, including Mather Biles Jr., and all the Anglican clergy in Boston, evacuated Boston on St. Patrick's Day. They didn't think of it as St. Patrick's Day, but we do now. In any event, they left, and so half the congregation is gone. Same time after the war, Boston's first suburban developments are starting to be built. Those suburbs were called Beacon Hill and the South End. And the wealthier merchants and sea captains start to move out of the North End into these new, fancier housing developments. So the North End starts to welcome its first wave of immigrants. First wave of immigrants were Canadian and English mill workers. There was a mill stream there. There was a mill pond where Causeway Street is, and they used the tidal power to run a number of mills. And so these mill workers came in, and the church started to thrive around 1800. They hired a young seminarian named Asa Eaton, who brilliantly built Boston's first church school. And this is a picture, there's a picture of the church in the early 1800s. To the left of it, that building, sort of Greek revival building, was Salem Street Academy. And that was built by the church as a form of outreach to the immigrant community. It was not for Sunday school. It was to teach kids how to read and write, because the immigrant kids couldn't go to Boston Latin or the few public schools in town because they really weren't public for everybody. So with that outreach, the church flourished. It grew to about 800 families, and you can skip forward. We'll see what the next slide is. Okay, now we're getting more into mid-century immigrant history. So the church flourished. 800 families. It immediately started to decline because as a port neighborhood, you get one wave of immigrants in, they settle for a generation, they're off. They're doing better. The next wave of immigrants that move in are the Irish that start to move in 1820, 1830, through about 1860, 1870. We did an archaeological dig in one of our gardens that we're planning to remodel. And the city archaeologist was delighted because he found what's a gold mine for archaeologists. I'm not sure, I'm not excited about it. It was an intact cistern. Back before there was any garbage removal, you didn't throw out much of anything. If it still worked, you kept it. But if it was broken, you pitched it in the cistern. So these cisterns, you get history that is, artifacts that are chronologically ordered and well preserved. And so we found this intact cistern that had the immigrant history of the immediate neighborhood from about 1800 to about right after the Civil War. Up to the Civil War, there's still a good bit of evidence in that cistern that English were still there. This was one of the last English pockets. in the north end. But right at the top of the cistern, you see what's in the picture here, which is a clay pipe with a shamrock on it. So you can see there is a new community that's starting to move into that neighborhood. The Irish, and that's the end of the cistern, because after the Civil War we started to have sewer system put in, and there's also trash collection. So the cisterns were, some of them were cleaned out. Fortunately, this one was not. But you lose that archaeological evidence. But that's a history of the neighborhood. The church is in kind of a long, slow period of decline because, go figure, Irish don't want to worship in an English church, and neither did the Italians, and certainly the Jewish population that was moving into the north end at the same time that the Italian population was, were not interested in joining the Anglican Church. Let's go to the next slide and see what we have. So this is a picture of an etching of the church after the Civil War, and this is when the neighborhood really starts to change. You still see this is looking down Hull Street. You'll see a number of wood-framed houses. Those start to be torn down and replaced with brick tenements to accommodate the Italian population that is moving, and it becomes a highly dense neighborhood at that point. Let's keep going. This is what the interior of the church looked like in the mid-19th century. It's not what it looks like now. You'll notice there are traditional slip pews in there. When Asa Eaton built up the congregation, they didn't have enough space for everybody to sit in, so they pulled out the traditional box pews that you'd see now, eliminated the center aisle, and put in these slip pews for more seating. And if you look up into the gallery in the rear, you'll see the bottom of a third balcony that they put in on either side of the organ. The other thing that happened to the church in terms of decor that you can't really see here is that over this course of time they put in more and more ornamentation. It becomes very popular. So by the late 19th century, the church looks like a Victorian tattooed lady. There is stenciling all over the place. All right, let's go next. Okay, so back to Paul Revere for a second. This is what I think of as the #1 money shot in Boston. Everybody takes it. I remember watching a Super Bowl with an uninformed announcer, and they put this shot up, and he said, "There's a church." Really? But in any event, the Paul Revere statue is installed in the park behind the Old North. That park was built in the 1930s by Mayor Curley when he was running for governor. It was a make-work project for folks in the North End. He tore down a number of tenements to open up a nice view between St. Stephen's Church, which is a Catholic church in the Old North. And then in 1940, they decided to install this statue of Revere. Why 1940? It's the beginning of the Second World War. Paul Revere is the kind of mythic image that surfaces every time we need to unify the country. It's a story that everybody knows, everybody loves, so they installed the Revere statue at that point. Of course, he's heading in the wrong direction, but be that as it may. All right, so he's there mostly because of the poem Paul Revere's Ride. It's one of the things we tried to teach, and as I was talking about it beforehand, I was teaching it the old style way, which is telling you what was wrong with it. We don't do that much anymore at Old North. We try to tell people the history of the poem. The poem is not history, but it has its own history. Now we can go to the next slide. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was an abolitionist. And in 1842, he wrote a slim volume of poetry against slavery. They were not great poems, but that's not why nobody liked it, because it was against slavery. He was a close friend of Senator Charles Sumner, so close that Sumner actually had a bedroom in Longfellow's house. And he worked fairly often with other prominent abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass. We know that while Longfellow was writing the poem, he attended a lecture by Frederick Douglass, and that probably helped inspire the poem. Paul Revere's Ride is published in 1860, just a couple months before the Civil War breaks out. It was a political poem. It was designed to stir up patriotic sentiment for the Union cause. He does a couple things with the poem. One, several stanzas focus on Old North Church. And what he's saying there is, the Civil War, God had blessed the American cause of freedom. And why do we know that? Because it was two lanterns from a church steeple that started the Revolutionary War. The other thing he does is he takes Paul Revere, who's just an artisan, not a billionaire, just an artisan, and he makes a hero out of him. And what he was trying to do was say, you too, by joining the Union Army, can help save freedom or extend freedom in this country. So those are the two dominant images in the poem. It becomes the best-known poem written in the Civil War. It is now the best-known poem in America. And one up by land and two up by sea. Just do a Google search, and it has more citations than any other line of poetry you can find. So that's why we're famous. But our challenge is people come thinking that it's all about the American Revolution. And we need to also teach that the poem that makes us famous is as much about extending freedom to those who were enslaved in the South. So that's the history of the poem, and that's a key piece of what we try to do there. What do we have next? 20th century history. This is the year I was born. In 1954, in August of 1954, Hurricane Carol, a Category 3 hurricane, comes roaring right into Boston. The hurricane actually shook the steeple for quite a while. They actually evacuated the neighborhood, so it was on the police radio, and a photographer heard that and said, I got to come up just in case something really exciting happens, and it did. So the steeple topples in 1954. That was actually the second steeple. A hurricane also knocked it off in 1804. So what you see now on the church is the third steeple. That was rebuilt in 1955 with the help of an American Airlines, which ran a pennies campaign with school kids across the country. They all saved their pennies, contributed it, and helped us. So now I'm going to shift conversation a little bit from our history to what we're trying to do to get ready for our birthday and for the 250th of the nation. And to try to remodel the campus. We're in the middle of a substantial capital campaign. We're trying to raise around $12 million to restore the church and to add some new interpretive space. And one of the exciting programs we're working on are in the garden. This is a picture of the campus. The gardens to the north of the church. Right now, the outer garden's a wonderful courtyard. The inner garden is not too usable now. It's dominated by a large tree, which we have now trimmed back severely, and hopefully we can keep that. But what we want to do over there is that the guitar pick that's in the oval, that actually represents a water fountain that we're going to put in. We're going to etch the whole poem, Paul Revere's Ride, on the side of that. And at the base it'll say, written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow on the eve of the Civil War. So we can make that basic point to our visitor. And then we can use this as an outdoor classroom space for the thousands and thousands of kids who come by every year. We're developing curriculum to go with that so they can begin to understand not only the history of the poem, but they can write their own rap poetry or whatever to understand the intersection of poetry and civil discourse. So that's one of our projects. We hope that one to get it underway next year. The first project we're working on, I don't have a picture of it now, the church, underneath the church is our burial ground. We have 1,100 bodies are buried under the church. We do give tours of that area, but they're brick tombs in a New England basement, so they're falling apart. It's moist down there, and so we need to make a major investment to restore the tombs and also to make it fully accessible, because we do tours down there. We've got to build a ramp in from the lower level. That project we hope to get started with this fall. All right, so this again is the image of the water feature. It's called a water table. It's not a big splashing fountain. It's a nice flat surface. And what we're hoping to do with it is that the flat surface will be reflective. And while you're reading the poem, you also see the reflection of the steeple right in that surface. So we think as an art object, it's going to be really, really cool. This is not the way the church looks now. This is the way, approximately the way the church looked when it was built. The last major restoration of the church was in 1912. That's at the height of the colonial revival movement. And one of the basic assumptions back there is that if it was old, it was painted white. There were two reasons for that assumption. One, if you found any really old paint, it was always white. Not because it was white, but because if you leave paint sitting in the sun for 150 years, it will be white. There was not much white paint in the colonial era. It was very expensive to bleach out all the impurities. And in the colonial era, they wanted to use paint to make the materials that they used look fancier than they actually were. So the church is made mostly out of first growth pine, and the windows, which we have restored, were painted buff. They were painted stone color, and they are now. We've done some paint analysis of the church where you bring in experts who actually very carefully peel away layer after layer of paint to find the original paint colors, and you cross-reference that with our vestry archives, which said, pay such and such, £5 for painting the wood cedar. So cedar was very popular wood, so a lot of the colors in the church were done in a faux cedar. There was a curtain over the east window. We have records saying it was that color green, so we're assuming that's what it was. There were some, well, if you look up in the gallery arches, you'll see in each arch there is a cherub, a winged cherub. We uncovered one of those while we were doing our paint analysis to see if it was still intact. It was intact. So we're very excited that when we get to this project, and this is still a few years out, a few years and several $1 million of fundraising out, we are going to restore all of those cherubs because we firmly believe that America needs more angels right now. So we'll get those restored. So this will be a big project. Some of it is, or a lot of it is just bringing all the building systems up to date, the electric, the fire suppression, all that. But it gives us a chance to return the church to its colonial appearance. If you go in now, it's all white or just off-white, which was colonial revival style. And people come in and say, oh, it's just another New England Protestant meeting house. And it's like, no, we were Anglicans. We like color. We like design. So we hope to get it back to that. Next. So I was asked before about we are a campus. We don't just interpret the church. This is the front of the Clough House, which was built 10 years before the church, and we have a couple exhibits, living history exhibits in there. The better known of the two is Captain Jackson's historic chocolate shop. You say, why would Old North be involved in chocolate? A couple of reasons. One, because we have to make enough money to take care of the church, and chocolate does sell. But more importantly, this is a way that we can raise a somewhat touchy issue, which is the nature of Boston's colonial economy. Boston flourished on what's known as the triangular trade, which was trade between Africa, the Americas, and England. And of course, what came from Africa but slaves. And those ships often pass through Central America or the Caribbean first. They'd put on molasses, and they would put on cacao, so raw chocolate. And we were able, we do this in conjunction with the Mars family and the Mars Corporation. And they had done a very serious piece of academic research that included an appendix that had everybody in the chocolate business in colonial Boston. We just cross-referenced that with our own pew owners list, and we found that 6 members of the congregation were involved in chocolate, and we chose Captain Jackson because the name kind of rolled off the tongue to name our chocolate shop after. So this is, if you come to the chocolate shop, we demonstrate how chocolate was produced. In Boston, it was a drink, it was not a candy. and it was much more heavily spiced than modern chocolate, and it was nowhere near as sweet because sugar was incredibly expensive. So you'll get a demonstration of that, but you'll also hear a little bit about the triangular trade because on the same ships that there were chocolate, there were also slaves, and so it's a way that we can introduce a difficult topic because everybody likes chocolate, and then you kind of find out what is in the trade called the dark side of chocolate. Chocolate has had labor problems in terms of abuse of labor since it was first discovered here, and it's a way we can talk to. And I got to say, I admire the Mars Corporation for funding the research that we're doing behind Captain Jackson and being willing to talk about that part of the history because it is difficult, and it's a challenge for them as the biggest producer of chocolate these days to make sure that there's fair labor treatment. So this is a typical spring day when we see lots of classes coming in, and this is inside the chocolate shop. We're demonstrating the production of chocolate with a bunch of kids. They all get a little taste of it. Children do not like it as much because it's not as sweet and it's a little spicy. Adults think it's kind of cool. All right, to conclude, I want to talk about a very wonderful ceremony we have. It is open to the public. It's ticketed right now. The only tickets available on our site are for major donors because we do a fundraising cocktail party beforehand. It's called our Lantern Ceremony. It kind of gets lost in a weekend because there's a little road race the next day that everybody pays attention to. We try to tell the folks in the road race, without our lanterns there wouldn't be a Patriots Day. But in any event, the first lantern ceremony celebrating Patriots Day was on the centennial of the nation in 1875. We did it up big. We actually had the son of the sexton came in and talked about what his father told him about hanging the lanterns that night. Our modern ceremony is really a lot of fun. It's a patriotic extravaganza. We get a bunch of the colonial militia from the area come in a grand procession. We have a very large fife and drum corps that plays for us. We always have an interesting keynote speaker. We read the poem. We also read part of Paul Revere's own description of the night. You can compare the two. We have music. It's a lot of fun. It is this year the 14th of April. It starts at 7 o'clock. Regular tickets will go on sale in another month or so. If you've never been to one, I recommend it. But I put this up in part to remind you that we are not that far out from this is for the centennial. The bicentennial was a huge celebration in Boston, and we're not that far out now from the 250th. And we really the historic sites have been organizing, trying to say, how do we appropriately celebrate the 250th, particularly in a time of our nation where we're pretty divided. Can we use history to draw people back together again? We're trying to get the attention of the civic and political leadership in town. The federal government has put together a 250th commission to begin planning. 3 states have put together 250th commissions. Massachusetts is not one of them. So if you know any powerful legislators who may represent this town and have a chance to talk to them, you may say, it's time to start planning for the 250th anniversary of the nation, because that's a time where we can use history to underscore the common values that we all share as Americans, to remind ourselves that we're far more united than we are divided, as much as people want to pull us apart now. That's the real vocation of what we do at Old North Church. We use history to teach American values, the values of citizenship, the values of volunteering and participating, risking your life as Paul Revere did, to risk his life to save our nation. Those are the kinds of things we want to teach, and with your help we can make a big splash in what we think of as the bicentennial, the 250th. We're always a year ahead of Philadelphia. They're talking about 2026. 2025 is Boston's story. And we hope as you look at your history here in Winthrop, you think about, what is your story when we come up on the 250th, but also that you participate with other historical groups around the state so we can all tell our story and in a way that underlines the values that we all hold so dear. So with that, I will take some questions.
Who's buried under the church there?
Who's buried under the church? There are a few well-known people under there. One is Major John Pitcairn. He was actually the head of the British Marines during the occupation of Boston. He died on the last charge of Bunker Hill. He was carried back. The British were using the church as a field hospital during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Also, they used the steeple as an observatory to watch the battle. So Pitcairn was actually carried back to the church by his son, who was a member of his regiment. Very sad story. And he's buried down there. We have the first captain of USS Constitution, Commodore Nicholson, was buried down there. He was a member of Old North and a member of our church vestry. Those are the two best known, other than Dr. Timothy Cutler, who founded our church. And if you're a Yaley, you know who he is, and if not, not so much. Yeah. Yes?
With the renovation, are you going to keep the dog tag garden?
Oh yeah, the dog tag garden is going to be there. It was just featured in the Smithsonian magazine. We built in the rear of the church, in the gardens in the rear, we started about 10 years ago, just with a simple memorial to all our servicemen and women who've lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what it is, it's a half circle of posts with wires strung between them, and there's a blank dog tag for every service person who's given their life there. This year, we just, with the help of our British friends, we installed a poppy wreath a bronze poppy wreath to remember, our allies who've given their lives there, as well as a nice bronze plaque that explains it to everybody who comes by. Everybody who comes through the campus stops there and just ponders and thinks, because you see it's getting close to 7,000 deaths now. You see 7,000 dog tags just kind of in the wind, make a gentle sound and understand what we've given up there. Yeah.
Do they still have the original lamp?
There, our sexton later in life needed some money, so he sold it to a collector, and it got passed along a couple times, and that collection ended up being the founding collection of the Concord Museum. So there is one lantern. It's out in Concord. Long end of the ride, but they own it fair and square. So, yeah.
What did you do with the artifacts that you recently discovered?
When the city comes in and does digs like that, they own everything that they find. So they are cataloged. They're out at in West Roxbury, which is where the city archaeologist stores all his stuff. Some of it comes out for display. When we remodel the garden, we're hoping to put a few things there so we can interpret that area as well. Yeah.
They're redoing the around the Paul Revere statue.
Yes.
Is that who does that? The city or the state?
That's the city is doing that. That's a city park. They're investing close to $3 million in that. It had never been it was designed as a low maintenance park, which in city parlance means no maintenance. We've actually for the last 15 years maintained the trees. We brought in every 4 or 5 years. We've raised 15 or 20,000 to keep the trees going, because they're actually overgrown for what can be sustained there, but we're trying to keep them going. Anybody else? Yeah.
Is there any story behind how the parish became a mission?
Sure. The parish, as I said, was declining in the 19th century. It got to be so small, the church was really falling apart. In 1912, our Bishop William Lawrence family, Lawrence, Massachusetts, quite wealthy, was embarrassed because his friends would come to town. They, starting to come up as a tourist attraction. They'd look at it and say, "Bishop, this place is a mess. Why aren't you taking care of it?" And this church was still, to be a voting member of the church, you had to own a pew. and they just weren't selling pews to anybody, so it was a very tight-knit but shrinking community. And Bishop Lawrence wrote an autobiography. He included a chapter about Old North in it. And he said when a couple of his opponents at Old North were called to the great box pew in the sky, he was able to come in and himself be voted as rector of the church. And at that point he did a capital campaign and restored it in the colonial revival style. It stayed an independent church until the Second World War. At that point there were next to no Anglicans still in the neighborhood. There were a few wealthy Brahmin families and mostly women who kind of looked after the place. But the diocese stepped in and reduced it to a mission so that they could, help maintain it. Yeah.
What was the price of the pew?
What's the price of the pew? It would range. The ones up, it would be backwards now because the ones in the back would be the most expensive because that's where everybody wants to sit. But back then, it was the pews up front. They could range up to 25 pounds a year, which is maybe $10,000 in modern parlance. So they were expensive, but there were no golf clubs to join. There wasn't, in terms of leisure time activity, was the church or not much anything. Yes?
Could you speak a little to the designer of, or how you went about getting the water, or you referred to the water table, the fountain with the pulpit? Was that like, somebody says contest, somebody says somebody local? How was, who designed that and and how was it adopted?
We work with a major architectural firm in town. We have basically an architect on retainer. We work with Elkis Manfredi, which is the biggest firm in town, and we're kind of a pet project for them. We're not one of their big box skyscrapers, but they like to do something that's relevant as well. And it was when we started designing this, it was their recommendation. We put a water feature in there, and then they recommended a firm out of Los Angeles, which is, I guess, the leading fountain designer in the country, and they gave us several different ideas of what to do, and we kind of narrowed it down and said this would be nice, and then we're out trying to measure it, and I was actually out there with a portable standing mirror tipped on its side to say, okay, if we put it here, we can get the the steeple in. So it was a collaborative effort. But the original vision is we want something that we can put the whole poem on, and add some water to it. It's hot back there in the summer, and water's moving water is just a calming sound. So it came together that way. We're also going to be at the entrance to this church. We're working with a local black artist who's going to be doing an artwork that kind of lets people know something interesting is happening back there, because that space is kind of around the corner, and he's going to be doing a kind of a modernistic piece that picks up the steeple and Paul Revere's statue, but in a modern way. Interesting guy. He also teaches at Brighton High School, and he brought his whole 9th grade class in to use this project as a field education project. So we were able to introduce these kids who have some artistic talent to the profession of landscape architecture and design. Our landscape architect worked with us. We had a contest with them, see who could come up with the best design. And we'll probably incorporate one or two of their ideas back there. So it was really fun to do that. But we wanted to have a way to involve members of the black community, because this is as much about black history, the poem, as it is about broader American history.
Steve, where can we go? Where's the best place to go on November 6th for Steve Ayers Day in Boston?
For Steve, I don't know when there'll be another Steve Ayers Day in Boston. That was for my 20th anniversary there a few years ago, so I don't think there'll be another Steve Ayers Day for quite a while. In fact, when folks come to Old North at the end of the day, they don't ask me that question. They ask me, where do you go to eat? So that's thank you very much.
So